Hello, everyone. Part of us, are back from leading a delegation to Israel over the last 8 days. It was a very special experience to be in Israel with members of parliament from France, from Germany, from the three Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. And I have to tell you that we have important friends in Europe, mainly in Central and Eastern Europe. The Baltic countries came to Israel as tremendous champions of the Atlantic Alliance, of the Western Alliance, where they see Israel and countries in Europe fighting the same fight, whether it's called Iran or Russia. They're deeply committed to their relationship with Israel. They see it as existential to them as it is to us. And we all believe that Israel should be investing more in those countries, and we should be listening to the voices coming out of the Baltic and Central and Eastern Europe. So please pay attention to the materials that ELNET has been putting out this week. It's a wake-up call to us. These are countries that need us, and we need them as well. And if you look at the conversation here in America, I would recommend that everyone look at the Atlantic Monthly's piece today by Franklin Foer. The golden age of American Jews is ending. So there are issues that we're all facing here in North America and in the West in terms of the Jewish communities, college campuses, and beyond. But we're also looking very carefully at the situation in Israel. The war in the South continues. The threat in the North continues. All of us who are on the ground were deeply touched, both by meeting with families of hostages, meeting with soldiers all across the country, visiting the South, going to the kibbutzim and to the Nova Festival area where the atrocities took place. It's one thing to see it from afar, but believe me, being on the ground and seeing it with your own eyes is something completely different. And we all came back completely committed to this cause. We need to make sure that Israel has the support, not just from America, but from multiple countries and certainly European democracies that are standing with us despite all the challenges that you'll hear about from our speaker in a minute. So this is a call to all of the supporters of ELNET to join us, to contribute, to invest, so that we can bring more and more delegates, leaders from the West, from Europe to Israel to see it with their own eyes like we did. I'll just end by telling you that not only did we meet with families of the hostages, but I myself met with families of bereaved, of fallen soldiers. I participated in a kiddush where the family stood up at the end of the meal and said a special prayer in memory of the soldiers that died in this war for the survival of Israel. And the number of names that were mentioned by this family that they know personally, crossed 20, both men and women, young boys and young women who fought and fell in this war. And I think we all need to take with us the fact that this will be with us. It will be with us not for a year, maybe for 5 years. We also heard that time frame in terms of the threats that Israel will need to face. There's much to do, but in terms of our work at ELNET, we bring the West together. We contribute to the understanding in Europe that Israel and Europe and the West need to work together. So without further ado, Daniel, the floor is yours to introduce our program and speaker. And please remain supporters of ELNET. Daniel, go ahead.
Thank you. So indeed, Israel has now been at war for 150 days. 150 days during which, according to Defense Minister Gallant, Israel had to confront and still has to confront 7 simultaneous fronts. Today, we're going to discuss the 8th one, the legal one. As you all know, South Africa's case has brought the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, to the forefront of Israel's legitimacy battle and has led Israel to react and send a very able team to defend the outrageous probes brought against it. But alongside that legal team specifically, there are experts who work endlessly to defend Israel in that arena over the years. And Andrew Tucker, here with us today, is one of them. Andrew is the Director General of the Hague Initiative for International Cooperation, also known as THINK, a European-based legal think tank challenging lawfare against Israel and promoting positive relations with the Jewish state. Through its comprehensive approach of analysis, education, advice, and advocacy, THINK aims to empower individuals and organizations to understand the intricacies of international law. Andrew will share his valuable perspective today on the complexity of international law in this context, especially in times of war after the 150 days of fighting, with a special focus on South Africa's spurious case against Israel at the ICJ, but also in the context of a special request done by Fiji to the ICJ he was involved in. So without further ado, I understand, Andrew, you have a presentation to share with us. I'll give you the floor and we'll continue after that. Please, Andrew.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you so much to the ELNET team. And I want to say I really value and appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's vital. I think the partnership between Europe and the rest of the Western world is important for many different reasons. I myself am an Australian lawyer, grew up in Australia and qualified and worked in the United Kingdom, and I've been in the Netherlands now for 30 years. And as an international lawyer, very much focused now on the Israel-Palestine issue for the last 15 years or so, working closely in Brussels and in The Hague. And The Hague is, of course, the international legal capital of the world. It's a little bit of a forgotten corner of the world. The Hague is not the biggest city. It's a very pretty city, by the way, but it happens to be the home of many important international legal institutions as well as international embassies. So it's quite a hub, actually, in the legal sphere. And what we're going to talk about today is the lawfare against Israel. As Daniel rightly said, I think it's the eighth front that Israel is fighting. And to be quite honest with you, I think Israel's been fighting this battle ever since 14th of May, 1948. And as we've witnessed these last 2 weeks, in fact, ever since the Balfour Declaration of 1917, the idea of a Jewish homeland has been controversial and never accepted in the Arab Islamic world. And they've been fighting this battle continuously. And now, I think, in a way, the 7th of October unleashed not just a kinetic war on the ground, but also a legal war. I didn't quite expect this. We see anti-Semitism is exploding on the streets of Western countries. I live in Europe, and I see it in Amsterdam and Paris and in Berlin and wherever else. And it's very much connected with the ideological battle against the very existence of a Jewish homeland. So in a way, I think this is a battle. Some people have referred to it as, another war of independence. Israel is fighting for its existential right to exist. So I want to, with your permission, just walk you through a little bit what's been happening here in The Hague over the last few weeks. And in order to do that, I'm going to bring up a presentation. If I can find it on my screen. Let's see here. Where are we? Okay, here we go. So here we are. Is that visible, Daniel?
Yes, yeah, all good.
Okay. So Israel on trial in the International Court of Justice in The Hague. You can see the court here. This is the Peace Palace built before the First World War. You might recall the Hague Conventions of 1899 as the 19th century came to a close, and the whole idea of a new kind of legal system, very much a European idea, came into place, and a lot of nations gathered in The Hague. And this building, the Peace Palace, was actually built by and financed by Andrew Carnegie, a very famous American philanthropist. And it is known as the Peace Palace. It was intended to be the place that would end world wars because there would now be a justice regime, a court that would decide conflicts between nations. That's obviously not been the case. Ever since 1945, it's the home of the International Court of Justice. It's a court with 15 judges representing different geographical regions, but also different ideological regions of the world. And we'll come back to that in a moment. It's a very diverse court. There are two main legal institutions in The Hague. One is the International Court of Justice. The other is the International Criminal Court. They're very different bodies. The Court of Justice is our topic tonight. Today, it's the oldest one. It decides disputes between states. And it decides or gives advisory opinions on legal issues. The International Criminal Court is much younger. It's only 20 years old. And that's a criminal court. It prosecutes individuals. Now, that's important. We can talk about that another time. But the criminal court the prosecutor is Karim Khan. He is a Pakistani British lawyer, a very capable one. And he is leading the court. And he has said very clearly that the court has Israel very much on its radar and is investigating, and is under a lot of pressure to investigate Israeli leaders for the war crimes in Gaza. We're going to hear more about the ICC. But for the moment, it's about the ICJ, the World Court. As I say, it has two responsibilities. One is in relation to contentious cases and one in relation to advisory opinions. You might recall 20 years ago, almost exactly, the very famous advisory opinion in the Wall case that was brought after the Second Intifada. Obviously, Israel was constructing its wall, and the General Assembly asked the court for an opinion about the legal consequences of the wall. Advisory opinions are non-binding. They do not bind any state. They're not legally enforceable. But they're terribly important. They're regarded as very, very authoritative. So anything the court says is taken by many in the political world, but also in the legal world, as being absolute truth. And in 2004, one of these things the court said was that Israeli construction of settlements is illegal. And this was the beginning of the mantra that all settlements are illegal. Simply because the court said it in that way. Now, that's not the case, as we'll discover in a moment. It's definitely not the case that all Israelis living outside the Green Line are doing so illegally, nor are all formally recognized settlements illegal. At the moment, we have three cases before the International Court of Justice. The genocide case we'll look at in a moment between South Africa and Israel. There's also a case that Palestine has brought against the United States for moving its embassy to Jerusalem. That case is dormant. The court's not really doing anything with it at the moment. The United States is ignoring it. The United States says, we don't have a conflict with Palestine. We don't even recognize that Palestine exists as a state. So that case is not moving, but it's one of the many cases that the Palestinians are launching in these institutions. South Africa against Israel was a case really led by the ANC, and we know that ANC has very close contact with Hamas and with Iran after October the 7th. There's evidence that Iran even financed this case brought before the Court of Justice. It's bizarre that South Africa should be bringing proceedings against Israel, but it's able to do so under the Genocide Convention because both South Africa and Israel are parties to the convention, and the convention provides for the court to have a role in resolving disputes between state parties to the convention. And South Africa says we have a dispute with Israel about whether or not Israel is committing genocide. Now, we're all familiar, I think, with those proceedings in January this year, resulting in the decision on the 26th of January. A very curious decision of the court. it's called constructive ambiguity. This is a typical technique of the court to come out with a decision that really is not really a decision at all. And the court said, this was in the context of preliminary proceedings. So the court really only had to look at the question, does South Africa have a plausible case? Wasn't looking at whether or not Israel is actually conducting genocide or not, but is there a case that's plausible enough for the court to get involved in? And it decided that it is indeed plausible that possibly in some scenarios, South Africans might have a claim that the Palestinians have a right to be protected against Israeli genocide. And this has raised this whole issue. Many are claiming this is a victory for the Palestinian side. Israel claims it as a victory because the court did not order a ceasefire as the South Africans had asked for. So everybody's claiming it as victory. It's a very, as I say, ambiguous decision, which is a reflection of the fact that the court consists of 15 judges from many different backgrounds, and they all, at least a majority of them, have to come to a consensus about a decision, which is highly problematic with this course. Because it's such a political court, you never quite know what it's going to do. But the bias of the court is, generally speaking, very much against Israel. Now, in a crazy way, we've now seen Nicaragua suing Germany in this same court, also about the Genocide Convention, claiming that Germany is supporting Israel to commit genocide, and therefore Germany is in breach of the convention. And Nicaragua claims it has a right to stand before the court. So the court is actually going to be flooded now with all kinds of cases, I think, under the Genocide Convention. So I want to move on now and talk about the other case that's before the court, and that's the advisory opinion on the Israeli occupation. And I think, in a way, this has been less spectacular, less media attention, but it's potentially much more dangerous for Israel. This is a full-on attack on the sovereignty of the state of Israel. In fact, I think it's an attack on the very existence of the state of Israel. At the end of 2022, the General Assembly, 87 states, that's less than half the number of UN member states, managed to pass a resolution asking the court for an advisory opinion, very one-sided, a very tendentious, prejudicial set of questions. And it's all being pushed by this minority of states. It's the League of Arab States, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, most African states, and a number of South American states. And unfortunately, the Western world is largely absent in all of this. This is part of the problem, is that too many states are sitting on the fence and they're failing to push back against this, which is a very patently politically driven campaign using the jurisdiction, using the terminology of international law. Israel has decided not to participate in these proceedings. Very important. They did submit a very short statement in July last year, which basically said the whole thing is ridiculous. We don't recognize the legitimacy of these proceedings. And they decided not to participate going forward. There are arguments for and against this. I know there are many who think Israel should be, but it's also a question of resources. Israel doesn't have the resources to be managing all of these cases which are coming. The genocide case was a huge one for Israel. As I think you introduced already, Israel sent a wonderful team to the court to put that case. And this one's coming on the back of the genocide case. And anyway, for rightly or wrongly, Israel's decided not to. Now, this is the question that the General Assembly has put to the court. We don't have time to go through it in detail, but in very short terms, the court is being asked to decide on the legal consequences of Israel's ongoing violation of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. This is the core of it. It's all about the right of the Palestinians to self-determination in the territory that they decide should be their territory. It talks about the prolonged occupation being illegal. It talks about settlement, annexation. It's talking about Jerusalem, not only East Jerusalem, but in fact, the whole city of Jerusalem is being claimed. And it talks about Israel's discriminatory legislation. This is a very one-sided set of questions that the court is being asked. Now, the state of Palestine is appearing before the court. Now, you may ask yourself, what is the state of Palestine? Does it exist? Well, apparently, according to the United Nations, it does. Even though as a matter of international law, the International Criminal Court has decided Palestine does not qualify as a state. It is a state party to many treaties, but it's not really a state in international legal terms. It has the ambition of being a state. It's a state in perhaps under construction, but it's not fully acting as a state. And one of the key reasons it's not a state is because it does not have an effective and independent government. We saw last week the Palestinian government resigned because they cannot create a fully independent, functioning government that governs the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So there's an internal civil war going on within the Palestinian territories. Nevertheless, leading international jurists like Professor Philippe Sands, you see in this picture, he's one of the most famous international lawyers in the world, representing the state of Palestine before the court. And their case is very simple. They say Palestinians, ever since 1920, have a right to self-determination. Palestine belongs to the people of Palestine. And the Jewish people came and interfered with that basic right. So even if we accept that the state of Israel exists, actually we should be recognizing now the right of the Palestinian people, going right back to 1920, to their state on the territory that they claim to be their state. That is, at the very minimum, everything, every inch, every centimeter, right up to the green line. That's the East Jerusalem, which, as we know, is northern part of Jerusalem, southern Jerusalem, and eastern Jerusalem. Everything in the West Bank, all of the Gaza Strip, belongs to the Palestinians, and they even make a claim going beyond that. And the argument is quite simple, that the occupation since 1967 may have been legitimate in 1967, but it's become illegitimate and illegal because Israel is effectively annexing this territory that belongs to the Palestinians. And the greatest piece of evidence of that annexation is the settlements, what they call implanting Israelis into this occupied Palestinian territory. Their demand is a total, immediate, and unconditional end to the occupation. They want tomorrow, today, every Israeli civilian and military to be removed from these territories, and they want the United Nations to compel third states to make sure this happens. So Israel is being positioned as the modern apartheid South Africa, where the world needs to impose sanctions, boycotts, divestment, every possible mechanism you can think of to make sure that this illegal occupation is removed. And it's a very simple and compelling kind of argument. Unfortunately, it overrides completely the idea of a sovereign state of Israel. I'm going to move on, Daniel, because I know we're a little bit short of time, but I want you to understand it's being pushed by the League of Arab States. There are three organizations in these proceedings, the LAS. We have here another leading British academic barrister who put a very extreme case, very extreme case on behalf of the League of Arab States. We have the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, 57 member states, and they start their claim with the Islamic Arab dominion over Al-Quds, Jerusalem. And they're not just talking about the old city of Jerusalem, they're talking about the whole of the city. A small number of states were supporting Israel, United States, Hungary, United Kingdom, Zambia, and Fiji amongst them. They were the main ones. So that's a small number, like 10% of the total number of states participating in these proceedings. And we had the honor of working with the government of Fiji, which I think is kind of, it's a curious thing. Fiji is a very small country, only 1 million people, but it's a voice, it's a state in the United Nations, and it leads the Pacific Island states. There are 16 UN member states in the Pacific region. And the goal now is to mobilize these Pacific Island states under the leadership of Fiji to create a pushback against all of this. Now, we put arguments before the court, as did the UK and other states. The court is now in recess, it's deliberating. And I think within the next few months, we'll see a decision by the court. I think it's likely the court will issue an advisory opinion. There's a lot of pressure on the court to do so. It has never refused a request to give an advisory opinion, although it has a discretion to do so. The question will be, what will it say? I'm very concerned the court's been put with a massive case by the African Union, the Arab states, the Islamic states, and the whole raft of UN institutions, from UNRWA to the UN Human Rights Council, all these bodies producing reports after report since 1975, is all gone into evidence into the court, and it's all very anti-Israel evidence. Israel is committing human rights abuses. Israel is discriminating against the Palestinians. It's preventing their right of self-determination. It's going to be very hard for the court to ignore that, to push back against it. So I'm deeply concerned about these proceedings, and I think now is the time for a political campaign, a political/legal campaign to talk about these issues, to raise the problems that these proceedings entail. I think to push back against the legitimacy of the court getting involved in a political dispute like this, which undermines the Oslo Accords, by the way. It undermines the whole negotiated peace process. So I think if the court goes along these lines, the Security Council itself is being undermined. There's a lot of arguments we can be putting out there, and we would like to be involved and to help in mobilizing that process. I'll talk about the course, Daniel, in a moment, that perhaps towards the end we might speak about that, but I think I've spoken enough for the moment.
So first of all, thank you. It's not a very bright image you've just portrayed, unfortunately, but it's a very challenging one. So before I ask you about the response and what Israel can do or European countries can do, you've mentioned, and we know that the decisions of the court are non-binding and they're not enforceable, but what impact can it really have? Because the main question of whether Israel should participate in the case of genocide under the Genocide Convention, or even the second one you've presented, is whether we allow the legitimacy of that case. So, but what damage can it do? Because if we do not recognize it and undermine its legitimacy by not participating, but what actually can what can it lead to?
Look, it's political. So the influence of the decision, any statement that the court makes is used in political. So take the settlements issue. This sort of mantra that all Israeli settlements are illegal. has been adopted by the Security Council in Resolution 2334. If the court decides or indicates that occupation itself has become illegal, this is the core claim, this will be brought into the General Assembly, into the Security Council, and it will lead to a political process. Even if the US decides to veto Security Council resolutions, we saw Barack Obama and John Kerry not vetoing 2334. It managed to become a Security Council resolution. And this is being used now to impose sanctions, claims for sanctions and boycotts. We're going to see a massive increase in national court claims against any support for Israel. We'll see political pressure on the boycotting of Israel. We see it already in Europe now, even after the genocide case. The Netherlands, the court has decided the Dutch government can't supply spare parts to help the Israeli Air Force with their F-35s. Why? Because the Court of Justice said it's plausible that Israel is committing genocide, right? So these statements get used in legal proceedings, and national court judges, they don't know any better. So if the Court of Justice says something, even in a non-binding decision, it's used as a statement of international law in local jurisdictions. And I think this is terribly dangerous.
So in matters of the response then, you said that you're anticipating a flood of cases against Israel under the Genocide Convention. But we also seen something quite rare, if not, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like it's the first time where families of the hostages or families that are victims of October 7th have now brought a case in the ICJ against Hamas for similar crimes under the Genocide Convention. Is that response, if we flood the West or families or Israelis cases against Hamas or against Iran for violations of human rights or for violating the Genocide Convention on October 7th, does that seem like a response that can bring back the legitimacy of the court, or on the opposite, show its political bias?
Well, these are claims that are being made in the International Criminal Court. You can't get at Hamas in the Court of Justice because Hamas is not a state. There's no mechanism. The only thing that could be done, and it's something that I think needs to be looked at, is Palestine itself is a party to the Genocide Convention, I think. So a claim could be brought relating to genocide committed by Palestine. You'd need to argue that Hamas represents Palestine and Palestine is committing genocide. That's possible. The criminal court is, I know there are initiatives being taken on behalf of victims in the International Criminal Court. The problem with the criminal court, this is going to take many, many years before the prosecutor gets around to really looking at these cases. And in the short term, it does not push back against the Court of Justice. So I think the campaign has to be not through those legal institutions, but through the capitals into our member state governments to be putting the case in Europe into the other Western nations that they should be not taking at face value the claims of the Islamic and the Arab world.
Right. And in the meantime, I remind our guests, if they wish to ask questions, maybe submit them to the Q&A. And so regarding the ICJ cases, when do you expect there'll be a decision? Because the decision, when we saw in the past, sometimes takes weeks, months, if not years. So will it be relevant to then for Israel to continue this process at the ICJ and continue to push back or do this legitimacy if the decision will actually arrive long after the war's over?
Well, I think in 2004 took the courts 4 months between the oral proceedings and the opinion. I'm expecting the court's going to want to push this through before the Northern Hemisphere summer. So my best guess is May, June. I suspect the court's already started writing its opinion, even though we've just had the oral hearings. So there's a lot of pressure on the court to get something out fairly soon. It could well be July at the latest.
That's indeed very soon.
Yeah.
And what do you make now of the decision of Israel to actually send a team? It's quite extraordinary, and also there's a judge now as part of the judges that sit and deliberate, and the legal team that defends Israel now is Israeli and not necessarily just a statement or like in the other case. Do you think that pushes the needle?
Well, Israel sent a team in relation to the genocide case, right?
Right.
So that's going to take much longer. The genocide case, I think, will take many, many, many more months because a lot of third-party states are intervening. Germany's intervening, a number of other states. So this is going to take months and months, if not years, for the genocide case to play out. The advisory opinion is much shorter. Israel has not put a team there, so Israel is not defending itself. So you come down to these individual states like UK, Zambia, Fiji, which are relatively insignificant compared to the massive campaign of the Arab Islamic world. So there's very little that Israel can do in the short term. That's why I think the role really is for NGOs, for public sector organizations who have influence and can use influence into governments, into civil society in our countries to be talking about this and to be raising the fundamental issue. I mean, to be claiming that the occupation itself is illegal is really to undermine the existence of the State of Israel. If Hamas takes power in the West Bank and has control over East Jerusalem, what are we talking about? People need to understand the practical reality of this very, very extreme claim. And as I say, it's a legal one, it's a non-binding one, but it's got to play out into the political. And the mantra will be that, you know, Jerusalem belongs to the Islamic world. East Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is no longer the Temple Mount. It's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's Al-Quds. It's part of the Islamic tradition. So we've got to be pushing the narrative back that the Jewish people belong here. They have a right to existence. The State of Israel has a right to secure borders and boundaries. Resolution 242 recognized that. There is an Oslo process. There's a negotiation process. Palestine is not a state. All of these arguments.
And one last thing you did mention at the beginning regarding the genocide case, for example, that has been clearly financed by Iran. And it's surprisingly broad also by South Africa. Isn't that already something that is making the whole case a little bit illegitimate?
It is, you know, unfortunately, the court doesn't really look at these issues. First of all, it's not been raised before the court. And secondly, the court really can't take that into account. The court operates in a kind of a legal bubble, as it were, and it's just looking at the convention and the evidence that's put before it, and it will never look beyond that evidence. So unless Israel raises this issue as undermining South Africa's case, and this could be raised, but look, even if Iran has financed it, the question before the court is Israel committing genocide or not? That's the issue it's going to look at.
Right. For our first question, I'd like to turn to Larry Hochberg, please.
Well, this is just a general question. As far as the 57 countries that involved in the advisory opinion, what happened with the Abraham Accord states? Are they involved or not?
Look, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, they're all in there. And they're all pushing the line of the Arab states. No mention of the Abraham Accords. In fact, for the whole of the first week, we just had the oral proceedings. It took 6 full days. Palestinians started with half a day. And for 4 full days, nobody mentioned Hamas. Nobody mentioned October the 7th, and certainly nobody mentioned the Abraham Accords. So these, this is the parody of these whole proceedings, is the court is being presented with a reality that does not reflect life on the ground, even the political realities of, the Abraham Accords. So this is the difficulty of these kinds of legal proceedings. They were mentioned, by the way, by the UK, by Fiji, by others. So the argument has been put to the court, but not by the Abraham Accord states themselves.
Just to complete the report, how about China, Russia? What's their position on this thing?
The Chinese delegate got up and criticized Israel for invading Gaza and using excessive force and genocide and apartheid and all the rest of it. China as well.
Thank you.
And so if I follow up on that, obviously, we work with Europe and we do, the advocacy you mentioned, and we bring delegates here to Israel and we work in capitals. But one arena I would like to bring up is the European Union or the European Commission and the Parliament. Would resolutions there be considered at the ICJ? Is that something if a whole, a statement, a resolution, or a decision can influence these kind of proceedings?
The answer really is no. It's the UN member states, European ones, that are party themselves. I did, by the way, I forgot to mention Czech Republic, which also has put in a statement to the court supportive of the peace process of Oslo, and therefore pushing back against this whole set of events. So I think Czech, Hungary, France was also, I think, reasonably good in that direction. So I think whatever the European Parliament says is irrelevant to the court. What Joseph Borrell says in Brussels is will probably have more impact. And unfortunately, he's not pushing a very supportive line. So I think there has to be a change at the level of the European Council, not the Parliament, but the Council, and therefore the Commission. And we've got to build on the case being put by those European states that are standing up. The Baltics, although not represented before this court in these proceedings, are, I think, important in Brussels. Same with the Central European countries. I think Italy can be very helpful. The Netherlands, I think, is still got a lot of potential. It can play an important role in influencing other member states. And not to forget Germany. Germany did not make submissions to the Court of Justice, interestingly. That's unfortunate, but if Germany were to be able to make some kind of pronouncement, political pronouncement relating to this case, I think would be very helpful.
And out of curiosity, because we know that the court is biased and very much focused on Israel, but has there been any proceedings at all regarding the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, well, in relation to the Genocide Convention, so there are proceedings brought by Ukraine against Russia, and that relates to the Genocide Convention. But there are no other proceedings relating to occupied territories. Nothing on the Western Sahara, nothing on Northern Cyprus, nothing on Nagorno-Karabakh, nothing on the myriad. What about the Turkish occupation of northeast Syria? It's all absent. It's just the Israeli occupation, which apparently is illegal. But
right.
It's very hard for the court to extract itself from that and to look at the bigger picture. It gets caught up very much in the specific legal arguments put to it, and we have to say that the Arab and Islamic states they've prepared this case for the last 5 or 10 years. Really, they've been working at this since 2011. working behind the scenes, building the case, resolution after resolution, report after report, massive amounts of money. This is costing them millions and billions of dollars in legal fees alone. And what we just saw the last few weeks was just the fruits of that investment. That's what we're up against.
And was there any time that one of the decisions done by the court actually received any backlash that was not respected, that was called out for being too politically biased?
Well, sure. I mean, the court, the 2004 case, the opinion is highly criticized, certainly amongst legal scholars. It was weak in many areas of its reasoning. But unfortunately, in the political sense, it's taken as being very authoritative. So there's criticism of the court. And I think the thing is not to attack the court itself. That's never a very successful kind of strategy, but to make people aware how it's being used as a political weapon by states who are hostile to the existence of a Jewish state. You know, the Khartoum 3 no's of November 1967, the Arab League said no recognition of Israel, no negotiations, no recognition, no negotiations, no peace, right? That's their position. And yes, we've seen peace with Egypt, we've seen peace with Jordan, we have the Abraham Accords, but still, that's their position. They don't recognize Indonesia, Malaysia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. They don't recognize Israel.
And then, so you don't think that if there's a case to be brought to the court in defense of Israel and saying that you don't recognize the right of self-determination of the Jewish people, there's been countless attacks against the Jewish people, against the state of Israel. There's no, instead of fighting for the illegitimacy of the court, use it to its, to its, what do you call that, advantage.
Well, the only way to do that, Daniel, is through a UN resolution. This case got into the court because of a UN resolution, and the court has to answer a question that's put to it by a UN organ. So there's no right of access to the court by an individual, not even by the state of Israel, can't approach the court and put a case to the court for an advisory opinion. It can't put a case to the court against Palestine without Palestine's consent.
Right.
This is the dilemma. So there is currently no case before the court that is enabling Israel to, this would have been the case if they'd participated.
We have a question from Jeffrey Dunfeld, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Mr. Tucker, how is the court selected, and which countries have representation on the court? Any Western European countries?
Good question. Thank you. So yes, we've just had a slight change in the court in February. 3 judges went off, 3 new ones came on. United States has a judge. She's new to the court since February. She replaced the previous US judge. Her history is not friendly towards Israel. As an academic, she's an academic. The United Kingdom does not have a judge anymore. France has a judge. There's a Slovakian judge. There is, let me think, an Australian judge. We have also 1 or 2 other European judges. The others are, there's no Russian judge anymore. There's a Chinese judge, Japanese, Tunisian, Lebanese, Sudan, South Africa.
What's the methodology for their being put on the court?
There's kind of a rotating system. So the court has to ensure that all main geographic areas are represented. It's a very political process, and states get the opportunity to nominate judges to the court who are then elected by, it's very much behind closed doors within the UN. So they lobby. And in order to get enough votes, you've got to get the votes of the Arab world as well. That's the reality. This is the problem why you get judges appointed who tend not to be very supportive of Israel, at least not outspokenly so. Having said that, the Ugandan judge, you remember in the genocide case, she gave a very strong dissenting opinion in favor of Israel. She's very outspoken. I wouldn't say pro-Israel, but she supports the sovereign existence of the state of Israel. And she will do that again, I think, in this case.
How did the United States judge get nominated? What is that process?
I'm not sure how it works. Formally, she's nominated by the president.
Said enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
For our next question, I'd like to turn to Elia Leshmerny, please.
So the question is, what is the consequence if this International Court of Justice decides that Israel either committed genocide or some other wrongs? What is the actual consequence of it in real world?
Thank you for the question. It's a good one. I think the one we're talking about at the moment, let's distinguish between the two cases, the genocide case and the occupation case. The occupation decision, as we've said, is non-binding advice, but it will be taken politically, I would say, as authoritative, right? So if the court decides, as it's being asked to decide, that the very existence of Israeli military and civilians outside the Green Line is illegal, then this will be used in the General Assembly, the Security Council, every UN body you can think of, and by member states who want to use it politically against Israel to push for boycotts, divestments, sanctions. So I foresee if the court goes this direction, which is highly possible, we're going to see a massive ramp up of political condemnation of Israel. And, pulling out 500,000 Israelis from the territories, which is bizarre when you think Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip, and what did it get? It got Hamas. It got 7th of October. And that's exactly what the world is asking the court to demand, that Israel exposes itself again to this kind of threat.
But as you mentioned, the judges are picked and have to be elected by the United Nations, and you need to have the support of the Islamic and the Arab government. Clearly, Israel doesn't have a chance. Is there anybody who's paying attention to that and thinking try to correct that particular problem, or we just have to live with that?
It's very hard. A lot of people have been talking about this for years. The political nature of the court appointments. Robert Jennings was a famous president of the court. He wrote an opinion way back in the 80s criticizing the UN system as being biased against Israel. You have these, but the political reality is you can only change the system from the inside. You've got to get a majority of states to change the system. And the UN will not reform itself.
So on that note, before I jump to our next question, isn't the fact that Israel sent a team would have, in the occupation case, would have made it last longer and potentially being Israel's voice being heard? Or, as you said, it's not so black and white?
Look, I think in the ideal world, Israel would have been great if Israel had been there. I understand the arguments for not doing it, so I'm not criticizing Israel, but I think it makes it hard. The court is just not receiving a lot of legal and factual evidence that it needs to make a balanced decision.
Right.
And if Israel had done that, it would have been a massive job to do it.
Defend.
Yeah.
And for our last question, I'd like to turn to Omri Dahan, please.
Thank you so much. My question is Israel going to condition a peace agreement with Saudi Arabia when that conversation happens on them supporting Israel in these courts and proceedings? And has there been any discussion about that?
That's an awesome question. I'm not aware of that. That's a very good one. It would have been good if that conversation had happened a few months ago. We wouldn't have had the Saudis doing what they did last week, the week before. Unfortunately, they've put their case now, the Saudis. So they can't turn that back. And that's really unfortunate. Because I think that should be part of any negotiation strategy would be public support by the Saudis in every political forum that you can imagine, and the legal one is one of them, surely.
Yeah, most definitely. Thank you. I think this brings us close to the hour and to conclude our conversation today. And so for our closing today, I'll just like to mention that unlike the sort of dark picture that we've painted here, we've been working on advocacy for the past few months. I know you have worked on it very hard in The Hague, and we have across Europe to bring parliamentarians and to do this advocacy in capitals, but also in Israel. We have brought 21 delegations to Israel since October 7th with over 250 parliamentarians. And this is the way to fight back, to show what's happening on the ground, to show that there is bias all throughout some organizations and some multilateral organizations. And it's only if we stand together, as you said, as organizations, countries, with Europe, we can fight back, and we can promote the truth. And as David said in the opening just before we started, it's when you see things on the ground. Last week was our busiest week since October 7th. Had over 40 delegates that were here all across, and they've seen, and they go back and they understand, and the pressure it continues hopefully as a snowball effect. So yeah,